Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. My goal is for each of us to grow personally, professionally, and financially, one conversation at a time. To do that, we will have conversations with subject matter experts across a variety of modalities. My job as your host will be to dig out those golden nuggets of wisdom that will facilitate our growth. Join me on this pursuit. When I started my podcast, I knew that the goal was to help myself and other people grow mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially. So when I found Keisha Blair's book, Holistic Wealth, 32 Life Lessons to Help You Find Purpose, Prosperity, and Happiness, I knew I had to have her on the show to have a conversation about those concepts because she embodies the idea of growing across multiple paradigms, what she refers to as holistic wealth. I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Keisha, welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'd love to start with you. What's motivating you in life right now? And what are 2 or 3 things that you want to make sure we get across to the listeners in today's conversation?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. So what's motivating me right now, I think, is just my overall mission. And, you know, in the book, Holistic Wealth, like I talk about everyone outlining a mission for themselves. And for me personally, that mission, you know, has to do with that message of holistic wealth, which I think is so pertinent for today's world. And so, yeah, that's basically my big motivating factor, apart from my kids and my family, which is also, you know, very important to me. And what was the second question again?
Yeah, what do you want to get across to people today? What do you want to make sure we don't miss in our conversation?
Oh, okay. I can't think of anything in particular, but, you know, I think this question about mission is important to me. That's one big thing. I can't think of anything else apart from the work I'm doing now with the Institute on Holistic Wealth. That's also very important work. Yeah, I don't know if you have any other ideas in terms of what, you know, I think I'm good.
Yeah, lots of ideas. So you've mentioned Holistic Wealth a couple times, and that's the book we are talking about today, Holistic Wealth, 32 Life Lessons to Help You Find Purpose, Prosperity, and Happiness. So Keisha, in your life, you went through a tragedy, and through the grief and struggle that ensued, you found a new approach to well-being for yourself that you're sharing with other people. It started off as an article that went viral and grew from there. And that, you've mentioned it a couple times, is holistic wealth. Can you share with our listeners what that journey was, what a broad definition of holistic wealth is, and then we'll dive into the book?
Okay, absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, the journey started with that viral article that was entitled, My Husband Died at Age 34. Here are 40 life lessons I learned from it. And in that article, I kind of spelled out, you know, these 40 life lessons that, you know, should guide us in life. And so that article went viral. More than 50 million people globally read it and viewed it. And then agents said, you should expand this article into a book. And, you know, when we dived in, you know, and we went through the 40 lessons, it was clear that this whole message of holistic wealth was what was, you know, embedded there. When we talk about, you know, lessons in financial independence, a lot of the lessons had to do with financial independence. Some of them had to do with mental health, emotional health, physical health, as well as your spiritual health. And so, you know, that's how I came up with that definition in the first edition of the book that was released in 2019. And that's the definition today in terms of, you know, those core pillars of holistic wealth and, you know, those key pieces that allow us to live holistically wealthy lives.
So focusing on not just the financial, but the mental, spiritual, emotional, physical, and financial, getting our whole house in order, if you will.
Exactly. Because I think what we're realizing now, and this is even coming more, you know, to the fore in the COVID-19 era, is that, you know, we need all these critical pieces to overcome setbacks. And a part of the core thesis of the book isn't just, you know, focusing on these things. It's well, how do we navigate setbacks? How do we bounce back? How do we become financially resilient and financially resourceful? And how do we use all these critical pillars to live more wholesome lives? And so, as we go through the pandemic and we're thinking about not just our finances, but how we really, develop resilience, that's also a key message in the book.
And one of the things that you talk about is picturing us as having a holistic wealth bank account. And every time we're making a decision, thinking about, am I making a deposit to my holistic wealth or am I making a withdrawal? Can you take us through that example? I thought it was a very powerful way to look at our life, is framing it through deposits and withdrawals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's a chapter in the book that talks about, and this is part of the holistic wealth method. And there's a chapter in the book where, there's that statistic that says, each one of us makes at least 30,000 decisions each and every day. And so what I wanted to drive home to everyone with that framework, with that method was, can you imagine if, we wake up every single day and we're making decisions, not mindfully, but mindlessly, and we're making these 30,000 decisions each day. They're micro decisions. They're really small, but they add up. And, it's like habits. It's like atomic habits. But these are decisions, daily decisions that we're making. And with each and every single one, we have the ability to become more intentional. And so if we make these decisions with that framework, with thinking, is this an addition or a depletion to my holistic wealth bank account? Then I think that is a great way to look at our decision making, to think about, things that we want to compound over time. Like I talk about some decisions acting like compound interest, like lifelong learning and skills development, like things like that. And so when we think about this addition or depletion to the holistic wealth bank account, we're really thinking about, okay, how do I build these decisions? How do I build these actions that really help me to, become. And whether your goal is to become financially independent or your goal is to, increase your lifestyle in terms of your health, this framework can help you do that in terms of these micro actions every single day that we take that can add as depletions or additions.
So the framework, we're essentially looking to build a toolkit whereby when we're making at least a conscious decision, so many of those 35,000 decisions a day are subconscious. But for the conscious decisions, we want to be able to run it through a bit of a framework to say, what's the right decision? And what is that framework or the lens that I'm going to make it through?
Absolutely. And if we think about, like someone who's going through a life-altering setback or someone, struggling through a tragedy, or through any kind of issue, then it becomes even more important that we do that, because then we think about how do we set boundaries around, or, in terms of our relationships, how do we, do that in a more intentional way? And this is one way that we can do that by thinking about, okay, when I do this, or when I go there, when I spend this amount, is that going to be an addition to my holistic wealth bank account? Or is that going to continue to deplete me? Especially if I repeat these actions over time. And that's what I really wanted to drive home to everyone is that these small micro decisions have such a large impact on us, especially when, we're going through these times, like what we are now collectively, or we're thinking about even our financial decisions and what we spend on and areas where we're saving and our investments. It's the same concept. And so that's the whole notion of, this holistic wealth method that you talk about, the holistic wealth bank account.
Yeah, and you've mentioned it a couple times, and I think it's very important for us to dive into for people is the importance of compounding for these daily decisions. Can you take us, our listeners, through an example of what you mean by that compounding and the power that it has for us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one example that quickly comes to mind is, after my husband died, I'll give you like a real life scenario of how, this can work for or against you. So you can imagine you're going through grief, you've lost a loved one, and, everyone wants to hear what happened. Everyone wants to hear the story. So everyone's calling you and everyone wants to talk to you. But over time, and let's say in the days that follow, it begins to wear you down as you're repeating what happened. You're memorizing the scenes in that minute, in that tragedy. And what I had to do is I had to cut back on some of that, to kind of give myself that mental space so that, I could even just come to terms what was happening to me personally. And so we started screening calls. We started, looking for ways that, I could protect my mental space. I could have time for the kids, because when that tragedy happened, just to let listeners know, I had just given birth 8 weeks earlier and I had a 3-year-old. So I had 2 young babies and I had just given birth myself. So I was just healing from childbirth myself. And it was a pretty, traumatic period for me, just, having gone through childbirth, and that childbirth experience as well was also traumatic. So when I talk about, thinking about whether this is depleting you, like if those phone calls become too much and they start to deplete, which was happening to me personally, I had to then regurgitate the story every single time, go through what happened. And we didn't have many answers either, because it was a very rare illness, like 1 in 1 million people get it. And so I didn't have answers. Everybody had so many questions. And I think I talk about that in the book too. And so that's one very, very quick example of where, things can deplete. And then, and where having people around you that enrich you during that period can act like compound interest in that bank account. Because then if you're going through that period and you have those people who are enriching you, who are allowing you that space, because I remember having people around me taking those phone calls for me, taking over. That allowed me not only to rest mentally and physically, but to recharge and to renew and to take care of the kids. And that acted like compound interest in a bank account for me, because then I was able to, keep my energy reserves for, the kids, and to be able to do other important tasks. So that's kind of a very, very, a very important example of how it works. And to me, like when I talk about these things, these are the things that come to mind. Very, very critical moments in our lives that really can, impact us for a lifetime.
And that's an important point, because often when we think of compounding, we tend to only think about the positive sides, but there are negatives as well. And so constantly being put through that grief cycle of retelling the story, it's constantly putting you in, and then all of a sudden you're in that grief spiral and it's hard to get out of. So learning to shut off that and put on some positive compounding, that's powerful. Before we dive into the holistic wealth and the 4 broad buckets and some of the sub lessons, I thought it might be great if you could share with people your MFW, or motivation from within framework, which is based on 6 laws for life, because it seemed like you reference it throughout the lessons themselves. So it seems pretty foundational for the book. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So pretty early in the introduction to the book, I talk about this motivation from within framework. And within that, as you said, I outlined these 6 laws or 6 principles for holistic wealth. And the motivation from within framework is such a critical one. I find that even during COVID-19, and I just have a copy of the book here with me, but I find that even during COVID-19, we've had to basically go inward a lot. As many of us, were in lockdown, as many of us, were thinking about how we want to shape our post-pandemic lives. I think all of us went through that period of that existential kind of questioning about meaning and purpose in our lives. And I find that motivation from within framework is so important from that, in terms of, how do I, examine my life and what I want. And so the 6 laws, just for the listeners to know, I'll just go quickly through them. Law 1 is the law of abundance. Law 2 is spiritual self-renewal. Law 3 is purpose in life, and I have in brackets, in service to humanity. Law 4 is the law of reciprocity, and Law 5 is the law of natural harmony and balance, and Law 6 is the law of continuous learning. And all of these are part of that motivation from within framework, because I went through, and I guess as an economist, I kind of think in a more systems perspective a lot. And so all of these laws that I've laid forth here are so important in terms of how we renew ourselves and how we relate to our outside world, but also how do we channel that broader purpose in life in terms of what we're here for, and how we impact lives around us. When you think about the law of reciprocity and that give and take, and especially during the pandemic, I think a lot of that has come to the forefront. And then we think about the law of natural harmony and balance and achieving balance in our lives. Like, how do we achieve work-life balance? And how do we have balance with our relationships and our work and our businesses and how we prioritize? And of course, that law of continuous learning, we talked about that compound interest, and that law of continuous learning, I think, is also a part of that as well. And of course, the law of spiritual self-renewal, where, mindfulness and our daily decisions and what do we do to renew ourselves spiritually day after day. And all these things are part of that, framework, and also part of that, those critical pillars of holistic wealth. So like when we talk about the spiritual, the physical, the mental, emotional, and even the financial independence aspects, when we talk about the law of abundance and, having that holistic wealth mindset where we think of not only in terms of scarcity, but in abundance. So all of that's wrapped up in it. And it's kind of, as you said, Clint, it's like a foundation for the work and for the book.
So that foundation, what it then builds is you have, for the holistic wealth, the way you talk through it in the book, we have 4 broad categories that we focus on: intentional life purpose, financial independence, physical and spiritual nourishment, and goodwill and strong relationships. What I'd love to do with you is tackle each one and then go into some of the sub-lessons of it to just give people a bit of a window into what they're going to get in the book. And that way we'll tackle maybe 10 to 12 of the 32 lessons. And if people want the full 32, they can buy the book and do the learning, Keisha. The first one that I wanted to look at with you then was the importance of living with an intentional life purpose. Can you take us through why that's so important as a foundation for holistic wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the first part of the book, because the book is actually written in 4 parts. And in the first part of the book, we're talking about intentional life purpose and building that life purpose portfolio. And it's so amazing when you kind of couch it in those terms of having a life purpose portfolio. And I think it's powerful for all of us when you think about, okay, so what's in my life purpose portfolio? And so in that first part of the book, it outlines and different chapters go through it, right? In terms of what it comprises, which is amazing. And so, when we talk about a life well lived, so many times, even in the personal finance community, we talk about our net worth and we talk about our figures and financial independence. But what would that life well lived look like for you in terms of your life purpose? What is that life well lived? What does it look like? And if you were to think about living life on your own terms, what does that look like too? And I think, I love the fact that we're starting here, because I feel like for those pieces, it's really the basis for everything we do. And even in the personal finance community too, we talk about how we want to live and that intentional way and what that life well lived means for us and why financial independence is such a critical piece of that, right? Because we're also driven by that as the end goal. Like, I want to have time freedom or money freedom. So it's critical when you think about a life purpose portfolio to kind of couch that in terms of, okay, well, this is what a life well lived means for me. And this is what life on my terms would look like. This is exactly what it would look like. And then we talk about goals with wisdom and having those goals as a part of that life purpose portfolio, and critical pieces like lifelong learning and how you want to build that portfolio. But having a personal mission as well is critical to that, because it really forms the basis for that legacy piece. Okay, so what do I want to leave as a legacy for me? Yeah, I have these goals and I have this goal to become financially independent, or I have this goal to do X, Y, or Z. But then what's the overall mission driving that? So I really love that piece, because for many of us, and this is what about life purpose, is that for many of us, when we hit that financial independence goal, we still have that purpose and mission in life to fulfill. I don't think it ends with just like, yeah, I'm financially independent now and, that's it. It's done for me. I think it's it continues when that mission. So we have that mission, because each of us, I honestly believe that each one of us is placed here for a specific purpose in life. And it's always to drive humanity forward. And so I hit financial independence when I was 31. I was pretty young, but then I knew then and there, after my husband died, that I had this mission to fulfill. I had to use this story to kind of, to tell others why this is so important. So that's also wrapped up in your intentional life purpose. And in the book, at the end of part 1, you get some key steps on how to build that life purpose portfolio, which I think are very practical steps on how you can do that for yourself in terms of your own personal story and your goals in life and how, and what a life well lived looks like for you.
Yeah, and let's dive into 2 or 3 of those. And the first one that I picked was it tied to when you were at Garfield's funeral and you were hearing everyone speak. And what jumped out to you was that even if he lived for 30 more years, you would have probably heard the same story because he lived his values and acted on them in an intentional way. So that message wouldn't have changed over the arc of his life. And so can you talk about that living your values in an intentional way tied to your mission and how that can inform the arc of our lives as we build our portfolio?
Yeah, that's a very powerful example. Like, thanks for bringing that one up because you're right. And even today, I think if Garfield were alive today, it would be the same. He would have had the same impact on people by acting on those values that he espoused. And so that's why for me in chapter 3, when I talk about a personal mission and really highlighting those values, what's key to you? What's so important to you in terms of how, you manifest your purpose, in terms of how you relate to others and to help drive humanity forward? Because just to go back to Garfield's funeral and the days leading up to it, so many people came to me and they said, he had such an impact on my life and he was so young. But you know what? Like, what dawned on me was whether he lived to be 100 or, 35 or 75, that legacy would have been the same. And so what this is saying to us is we don't need an entire lifetime to make that impact. We can make that impact now, and we can start making that impact on people's lives and doing the things that are so impactful in life. And so in chapter 3, I go through various examples of people who've outlined a personal mission and different values that they've espoused in terms of their mission. And, whether it is to mentor, to build, and of course, I'm just calling on some action verbs here to give listeners like an example, some examples of how that works, or values or qualities or aspirations that you can reach for. So whether it's, building community or mentoring or encouraging, these are some of the action verbs and words and qualities and aspirations and values that, we can think about when we're thinking about our personal mission and our legacy. And once we start to act on them intentionally and purposefully. So just to go back to the example of Garfield's life, he had so many different types of, he was a CPA, he was a chartered accountant. But in addition to that, community building was so important for him. He built homes for Habitat for Humanity. He ran different races for charity. He used his skills as an accountant to help seniors in the community with their tax returns every year through the CPA and the CGA program in Canada. And so he would use his weekends to just do free tax returns for, people in the community. And this is just like a small snapshot of how he expressed his values practically. So whether it's community building, whether it's mentoring, whether it's encouraging, like these are some of the ways. And that's part of the reason why I think we can confidently say that if we start living out these values intentionally, we don't need 100 years. We don't need to live to 70. We absolutely can make that impact now and start building that legacy so that even if our life is cut short, and so even if, we're not around to that ripe old age, that, our lives will have been so impactful because we've been living in this mission-centered, values-centered way.
So for that listener who's, in their 20s and they're hearing us talk, or early 30s, and they don't know what their values are, Keisha, how can they find them? What's the path for them to get from where they are to finding these values, which would be the first step to then live that value-driven life?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, such a good question. And that's why we wanted to build it out separately. So in the Holistic Wealth Personal Workbook, so there's a companion workbook to the Holistic Wealth. I have it here. And it really is, it really goes through the case studies more of defining your personal mission statement, and it walks you through it. And then on page 21 in that book, we have a list of qualities and aspirations that you can then identify, and of course there are others outside of that you can draw on too. And here's the thing. The first thing that I, tell listeners to do or tell readers to do in this chapter in the personal workbook, in terms of, really looking at those values and writing them down, the first thing is look around at people you admire. Look around you at some people you admire. What qualities do they have? What can you learn from their attitudes and approaches? So if there are people around you that you admire, let's say, they've been, successful in one area or in another area, it could be multiple areas, right? Because we're looking at this holistically. Then, look at some qualities that they have. What is it that you admire and why? Write that down. And, it could be other people around you. And it could be about also what's important to you. So when you think about your mission and your purpose in life, what are the things that are important to you? Pick out those words that come to mind and jot them down. And also think about your unique contribution. So your story of self, right? Like, who am I? And what is my unique contribution? What is my story of self? How did I come to be here? And what are those experiences that I've had that I think could be so impactful to the world? That's your story of self. And then on page 21, so I walk you through all of that, right? And then you start listing your core values. And then there's a page with some qualities and some aspirations. And some of them, are there and they're there to kind of be joggers for you in terms of what you might identify with along with what you've written down. And so whether, as I said, in the previous example of whether it's being community oriented, innovative, maybe being innovative is a core value to you. Maybe being creative is a core value to you. Maybe being compassionate and adventurous is a core value to you. Some people want that adventurous lifestyle. Maybe being dependable and reliable is a core value to you. And consistent and efficient and passionate and courageous. And maybe being a lifelong learner is also a core value to you. So these are just a few that I'm picking out that listeners can draw upon, and you're thinking, yeah, a few of those resonate with me, and just write them down. And of course, there's lots more in terms of help that you can draw upon in the Holistic Wealth Personal Workbook. And that's why we kind of had to do that workbook after the book was released, to give people more of an idea of, okay, give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps to get this done. And that really does that.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the lesson, but how do I actually implement it and work through it? And you mentioned one there that I thought was wonderful, because you had a quote in your book by, and I may pronounce this wrong, Mayoko Taylor, and it was, comparison is the suppressor of all gifts and the destroyer of our life's true aspirations. When you begin to compare yourself to others, you start to focus on everything around you instead of what's most important. Your life becomes centered around what other people think, do, and what their expectations are of you. As a result, you begin to exist in a world where your passions begin to die within you. So can you tell us what that quote means to you? And that quote was coming from the lesson of an incomparable you. So can you talk a bit about the incomparable you, and where that jumped out was you were mentioning your story, your unique contributions, and each of us is unique. And so I love that one, Keisha.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that one too, because I struggled with that after my husband died, and that whole notion of, what should I be doing right now? Where should I be? I had 2 young children. And so I mentioned in the book, and, that, and like many women, like many people actually, that, I was on a corporate track. I was identified, within the organization as a part of this small elite group that would become lead the organization in a few years. And it was at that point that my husband died. And I really grappled at that point, after his death, with what my purpose was, and whether it was to do that kind of work, whether it was to stay in a corporate role or in the role that I was in, to do that kind of work. And that's where I think the comparison can be very, very, it can be a very toxic thing. If you're thinking about, okay, well, maybe I should go on the path that everyone's going on because everyone's doing it. It's society. This is what society says we should be doing. And you have a totally different purpose and a totally different mission. And so that's why that quote, I think, that you pulled out is so important, Clint, because I realized for me, that wasn't necessarily my purpose. And it was a very painful thing to go through because at one point I really wanted that. I think maybe because at some point we all want that as a part of an organization and we think we should, end up somewhere and drive that organization. But really, in retrospect, my purpose wasn't built around that. It was built around a larger message of driving humanity forward from this work and from my story of self, my unique experience. And it's so funny. A lot of us do the work, Clint, like we do the work in the personal finance community. We do the work in different communities that we're in, and the work looks similar, but then we have so many unique perspectives to bring to the table, or unique skills, where we're coming from, or different communities and what we can bring forth. And can you imagine, getting swept away looking at somebody else's purpose, looking at somebody else's mission, comparing ourselves and thinking we should be doing that when in fact our mission lies somewhere else, and kind of missing that altogether. And that's why I think that chapter is so important, because I don't want people to get to miss theirs, because it's such valuable work. It's such meaningful work. And when you're placed here for that work, that's when it becomes so much more rewarding and fulfilling for you. And doors start to open up that you never expect. And you start to meet people to help you, to guide you on that path. And when you're living in your purpose, it's that type of, that joy and happiness that nothing else can give you. So that's why that chapter is super important to me personally, and such an important chapter for this book.
Yeah, and something you said right there really jumped out at me, Keisha, because most of us do go through life not living for our own purpose, as you said, right? We partially because we're conditioned to think this is what my purpose is. My purpose is to get that job, get promoted, have a big house, have my 2.5 kids, And so much of that is societal programming, our ego, right? We don't even realize, do I actually want that promotion? Or is it just my ego that wants that promotion? Would I actually be better off not even working for this company and making less money? And we'll talk about this later when we talk about service to others versus the highest paycheck. Would I be better off just making less money, but teaching and guiding people and helping others achieve their dreams because that's what I want to do? Although recognizing that there is the constraints of doing it if you haven't achieved your own financial independence yet, which is part of that holistic wealth equation.
Absolutely. And so it's so important that you bring up that point, because I feel like that work and being able to do that work, the privilege of that really stems from being in a position where you are able to do that work. And you can, as you said, Clint, whether it's stepping back from a role that you don't think fits your mission and purpose, and even stepping back into something with less money is part and parcel of that decision, which is also rooted in what your financial resources are. And which is why financial independence is such a critical piece of it, because, it really enables you, it really opens up that door to be able to do this. And I mean, even if you're still on that journey, it's fine. Like, we know that even if you still haven't hit that magic number, it's fine. But it really is intertwined, and it, all the pieces work together. But for sure, and we've seen with the Great Resignation wave with this pandemic, how people have stepped back and they have, taken a lower paid job, or they're, doing a passion that they can with less, salary or money to be able to pursue their purpose.
And so let's pivot then. Let's dive into that leg of, I'm picturing now, and this didn't come to me while I was reading the book, but it is as we're having our conversation is we've got these 4 foundational pillars and we're holding the table of our holistic wealth. So we're able to pile it on there, but only if the pillars are really strong. And the second pillar is financial independence. So can we start by, Keisha, telling our listeners what is financial independence and why is it so important in our lives?
Absolutely. So financial independence, and this is just me, talking through it. I don't think there's a formal definition in this book per se, although, I think many of us right now have like a kind of gist of what that is, but it really is being able to live without that paycheck that covers your expenses and covers your day-to-day life, whatever your expenses are. And so being financially independent means that you can cover that for yourself, whether it's through other sources of income like passive streams, or whether it's from different sources, whether it's, passive income from real estate investing or from stocks or from wherever that passive income comes from, and different streams, right? And what adds together to make that amount that you can carry yourself without having to depend then on a paycheck or depend on an employer. And so that's what financial independence means more broadly. And it's such an important concept, I find, not because when I think about even my own experience, I never really had a goal to say hit a magic number at a certain age. I really didn't. I did have a goal of being financially independent though, because as I said in the book, I always valued that for me just because of my personal experience growing up. And, wanting to become fully independent, that just in case something happened, I always had that, risk framework in the back of my head where, if something happened, I'd want to take care of myself. I want to be able to have that freedom. And so that's basically where that's coming from. And, it's something that I think even if, you're on that journey, I think it's a worthwhile journey to be on for everyone. Because that's my personal story. And this is why I use my personal story as kind of always that, reference point to bring everyone back to why this is so important. So that if you need to step away for a time, if you need that break because you've had a tragedy in your life, you can. And you can dictate how long you need. And you don't need to worry about, having that pressure and that struggle of having to go back to a job if you're not ready yet, or of having to do something if you're not ready yet, because then the mental health piece and the emotional health piece is also critical. And that's why when we talk about holistic wealth, it's so important because it really ties everything, together so that we see, okay, this is why financial independence is so important, because it allows us that privilege of having that time and space to heal, or that time and space to take, to get our children on a path to healing, or our families on a path to healing. So for me, financial independence was always that part of that puzzle for me. It was never just about being financially independent. It was about always that piece that would enable me to have that life where I could authentically do these things to take care of myself and my family in a way that was authentic, and I didn't have to feel rushed and hurried and, feel pressured back into a toxic job if I didn't want to have that. So that's why it's so critical, this piece of the book.
Yeah. And so what I hear in your words, and generally my own view on financial independence as well, is 2 key concepts, right? Is freedom and choice. And so it's not necessarily about being super wealthy. It's simply about having enough money that we then get to choose what we do on a daily basis. It doesn't mean we won't work. It just means we choose what that work looks like if we do choose to work. And we have the freedom to live where we want, how we want, work when I almost boil it down to, the 5 W's. You get to work on what you want, where you want, how you want to work, if you want to work. And you could do it from anywhere in the world because now you have that freedom of choice and lifestyle. So a lot of people think it's just about retiring, but I think for a lot of us, and that's what I heard from you, it's more about having that freedom and the ability to make your own choices.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. So then One of the most important things, obviously, and you hit financial independence at a young age, so you were clearly doing this. And as an economist, your husband is an accountant. My wife and I are both accountants, so I get you. One of the most important things is planning, whether it's for your future or for longevity. And so can you take us through the importance of planning? And for the listeners, what are 2 or 3 things they should be focusing on today when they hear this conversation and they leave, or they read the book and they leave? What are 2 or 3 things that you want them really focused on in that planning, Keisha?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Planning is so important. I took that seriously even as I started out, with my career early on. As I said, I did have this goal to be financially independent, but it was driven by, as you said, choice and freedom. And being a young mom, like with 2 kids, it really brought it home more to me, even before my husband died. And we took a number of steps, and, investing became very important to me. The good thing about, I think, investing, and this is for everyone, is just identify what you love. Identify what you love. I always loved real estate. It was my number one, always has been, always will be. I drive by houses and I'm just like, wow, it's just a passion for me. And just identify that passion for you. Because for some people it isn't real estate, and I get that. For some people it's stocks and whatever else it is, just identify that investment. But I started doing that from a very young age. Like I was just itching to start, accumulating rental properties. And that's what helped me. And my husband was an accountant. And so he really did, like I would identify the properties and he would do the tax part, the accounting part of it. So it was like that real true partnership. But identify, the types of investments that you love and start planning for that. Start planning in terms of how you can invest and how you can leverage your income to invest, because all I kept thinking about was, I have this income now. I want to be at a place to become financially independent. How do I leverage this income to invest? And that's what we did. And as you know, when you go through the book, you'll see, it was that investment. It was my investments that helped me, in the days and months and years after my husband died, in terms of being able to have that choice and freedom. And of course, that planning is so important. So the other thing that we were very, very serious about was making sure that we had all our insurances in place. So life insurances, we talked about critical illness, disability insurance, all of those pieces. And we sat down because, I'm an economist, yes, but I always had a financial planner. And that person was also key and is still key in my life. Like where it comes to tax things and tax updates, like he calls me and he's like, did you hear about this update? And I have that and I need that because I'm not necessarily keeping up on that. And that's why having that ecosystem around you is a critical piece. But we sat down early on, even before we had kids, to figure out, did we have enough insurance? Like, where were the gaps? And surely he did find gaps. And, we upped our insurances and we made sure that we had enough. We did those long-term scenarios, that long-term risk scenarios. Okay, if one of you dies, do you have enough for the kids to last throughout university and school? And so that's the type of critical planning that's necessary. And look back at all your insurance policies. Even if you have insurance policies in place today, look back and think about the type of life you want to live. How we started out talking about a life well lived. Would that insurance policy help you do that? In terms of living on your own terms. So we planned, very, very early on in a way that was very, very intentional. And as I said, he was an accountant, so we maximized our taxes every year. We planned and we had this partnership. And of course, if you can do that in terms of those critical pieces, you don't necessarily need to be an accountant yourself. You just need to have those people in your corner who know about these things, especially once you start investing, to make sure that you're on the right track and that, you're taking into concern any tax considerations from your investments. And so that's what we did as well. And so, Clint, these are some practical things that are just so easy. Just, I think about what it cost in terms of a life insurance policy. I think I remember, we were in our early 20s when we took it out, and it cost maybe $24 a month. And for $24 a month, you can have that peace of mind to know that if something happens, you're protected. And so that's a key piece. And that's how we planned. And I planned meticulously. I worked backwards too, right? So I did this reverse budgeting thing where I said, okay, if I were to, I always wanted to retire early. That was just me. I just could not see myself. I'm just always this person thinking, I don't want to work until I'm 65. I want to, and this was even, as you can imagine, after my husband died, it got even more in earnest. It was just like, you know what? He died at 34. We need to live our lives. Like, we need to have that life where, even if my life is cut short, these things are important to me. And so retiring early was also a big, big, big goal of mine. And so I did that reverse budgeting to figure out, okay, how many investments would I need? How much investment income would I need? And if let's take even my pension out of it. I didn't even want that in the calculation. Take that pension income out. How much, investments would I need and how much income would I need to retire at this age by that? And I did that. And that's what kind of guided me in terms of how much investing should I be doing? How much leveraging would be appropriate? And those are, critical steps that I took at a very young age, because I just always, to me, risk was staying in one job forever, not being financially independent, being on a salary and not knowing if somebody was to, were to walk in and I would lose that job. To me, that was the ultimate risk. To me, that was a no-go, a no-go.
100%, right? Is we all have that. We have one salary, work one job, and think, oh, we're fine, no risk. It's like, well, look at COVID. So many people lost their jobs, and so many people were afraid, right? I mean, I was afraid. We were afraid. It just put it in perspective. My gosh, how much money do I spend a month? How much money do I spend a year? What would it look like if I lost this job? And luckily, I'm in an industry that fared quite well through COVID, but not everybody was. So that is absolutely accurate. So two things that I'd love to dive in that you just talked about there. The third one is you reminded me that my wife and I are supposed to up our insurance, and so I need to talk to her. So thank you for that. And number two is you talked about how you worked backwards. So I think what you said was you looked forward and said, okay, I want to retire by X age. I need to have a certain amount of income per year. That's going to tell me how much investment income I need. If I work that investment income, to have that investment income, I need this much in investments by this point in time. So I need to be doing this much per year to get there. Is that the strategy, the roadmap that you built?
That was it, exactly. And I think, with certain types of investments, it's easier to do that. I think real estate really lends itself well. You're getting rental income. You can I think it's easy, especially in some markets, to kind of foresee and predict how much rental income you'll collect from one property, and then based on rental increases every year, whether it's 4% or, whatever it is in a particular market, and you're able to forecast to see what that income could look like in, like, say, 10, 20 years. And so it was relatively easy with that type of investment to work backwards to see, okay, how many properties and how much am I leveraging and what am I likely to get, net each month. That all adds up in terms of this bucket to basically, allow me to live without any other kind of, let's say, salary income, or even if I take my pension income out of it. So that's the kind of, I think, backwards budgeting or backwards planning that's also helpful for listeners who are trying to think about how do you actually think about how much you need, in retirement. And when you look at like your daily expenses, and it's easy to kind of estimate how much you will need, based on how much is, you're spending now and versus how much investment income. Of course, anything else on top of that is just, it's just a plus, because then you've had that. And of course, if you've had a career, whether, in the government or private sector, you have that, pension income that you'll also get. And so you have those different buckets of income that you'll be able to, and in Canada, we're very fortunate to have a healthcare system, where we won't necessarily have to think about big pots of money put down for healthcare expenses. So the only other critical piece to me is like making sure you have your different insurances in place. So whether it's the critical illness piece or the disability. So not only just life insurance, but disability, critical illness, so that if that happens, you're okay. And you're not just drawing from your investment income, because you don't want to have to do that. You want to be able to have an insurance to do that for you so that you can leave that critical piece, especially if that happens before a certain age, right? Because it could be an injury, it could be an illness before a certain age, and you want your funds to last. You want your funds to last, and you want that investment income to last. So I think that's the other critical piece in the book. And in the new and expanded version of Holistic Wealth, I talk about financial resilience, which is a key piece for me. It's how do I bounce back from these life-altering setbacks? Well, all the pieces that we're talking about right now help us to bounce back. And when we think about our decisions, in terms of our spending or money decisions, it should always be like from this framework. Will this make me more financially resilient? Like, honestly, is this going to make me more financially resilient or not? And for any bigger purchases, I mean, we have our day-to-day things that we spend on, which is fine. Like, I'm not saying cutting out a cup of coffee is going to make you financially resilient. But when we think about, big spending pieces, it's a useful way to think about, I talk about this holistic wealth portfolio now. We've talked about different pieces. So the financial independence portfolio is one aspect of that holistic wealth portfolio. In addition to the life purpose portfolio that we talked about, we would just want to make sure that we have a resilient portfolio that can weather setbacks, right? So like I tell, like when I train and I coach people, I tell them plan for 2 setbacks per decade, 2 big setbacks per decade. Your portfolio needs to be able to withstand that. And if your portfolio can withstand that, I think you're okay. When we think about like big economic crashes, we think about 2009, it took about a decade for the economy to bounce back from that, right? So we need to think about how we can bounce back. And when we think about the different pieces in our portfolio, it all needs to be there to help us to bounce back. So those are kind of like, some critical pieces that I talk about in this new and expanded version of the book that are so important when we talk about like an era of disruption that we're living in now. It's all disruption. And, as an economist, I remember, being a senior economist and tracking past economic crashes. And honestly, it took a long time. It takes a long time to recover. And we want to be able to be agile to bounce back and not take years and years and years for us to recover, which is another thing that really hinders that financial independence piece.
And part of that is, and you talked about it, you talked about leveraging your income. So I'd love to understand what you meant by that. And I think that also ties into taking measured risks, because if we don't take any risk, we're not going to generate any returns. So what did you mean by leverage your income, and how does that tie into measured risks, Keisha?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned in the book, and there's the entire chapter on taking measured risks, like we know it's important from an investment perspective to take those measured risks. So not to necessarily go too risky or to over leverage ourselves in terms of taking on too much debt, but just, making sure that we're taking on that adequate risk to build up that financial independence portfolio. So when I talk about leveraging your income, that's part of it. So it's like, how do I use my income then to acquire more investments or to invest? So not necessarily just to park it into a savings account in a low yield bank account and then not use it, which is, inflation would wipe that out. It's eating into savings. And, we need to be keeping ahead of inflation. And to keep ahead of inflation, what inflation is today, 6.7% in Canada in March and 8.5% in the United States, if you're there. So you can imagine looking at what investments, right, you would need to even like beating inflation or even breaking even. Exactly. And in this day and age, it's not easy, but there are investments. So, and that's where the risk comes into play now, right? Because then now you're thinking, okay, I'm going to have to take on more risk. So I'm not just investing in bonds. I'm not just sitting down in a low yield bank account, I'm going to have to go a bit more to kind of beat inflation with this. And this is where really doing your research and making sure that those funds that you're leveraging them. So not just having them parked in a bank account, but seeing how that money can work for you, whether it's, investing in different kinds of, so whether it's real estate, as I said, or another type of investment where you're beating inflation, that becomes, you're even breaking even. And in this day and age that, mortgage interest, a 5-year mortgage now, I think is almost at 6%, right? So that's.
Well, I think it depends on where you are. And for our American listeners, and I wrote something the other day about refinancing and leverage, and I received a lot of hate. And I think a lot of that, Keisha, was from Americans who are paying in the 5 to 6% range. But up here, where I live in Canada, if you go with a variable rate mortgage, you're still actually only paying in the twos, right? Because you're usually prime minus. Prime's at about 3.2% right now. So you'd be paying about 2.6%. If they do 2 more rate hikes, you're still in the threes. So I think it depends on whether you go fixed rate, whether you go variable. I think fixed rate, you could still get sub 5 in Canada. So in the low to mid fours. So it's just a totally different world than our American neighbors who are in that 5-6% range. And so if they're refinancing that home that they put a lot of debt on, it becomes problematic. So I think it definitely depends on where we live.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And I think variable mortgages historically, I think when you look at that, have always been kind of like a good option. But depending on, your risk tolerance and what you're willing to accept. And you're right, for the 2-year and the 3-year fixed mortgages now in Canada, you still can get like a decent 3-4% rate, I think, depending on the bank, of course, and where you are. But all this to say is, this is why investing is so important. This is why leveraging, your income is so important, so that in a high inflationary period that you're not losing out. And it's more important than ever before right now, I think, given what we're going through, and, who knows what's going to happen with the economy. And experts are forecasting a recession possibly for the end of this year in the United States, in particular. So I think it's just important that we look at our finances in a very, very diligent, intentional way right now. So I think, this message and this topic and everything we're talking about is so relevant right now.
And it's so interesting, right? Because everyone always forgets. This is one of my favorite topics. I work in real estate development, and everyone's always telling me about the interest rates going up. But what they always forget is that eventually there's a recession, and the response to a recession is lowering the interest rates. So it's not necessarily where are the rates going to be in a year. It's when is your mortgage coming due, and what are the rates going to be then? Because if they're a year after that recession, you may actually get a better interest rate than you got the first time. It just depends on where you are in the cycle. And I agree, they're going up. But if we say, where will they be in 2 years? I'm not going to weigh in on that, because I think they're probably actually going to be comparable today or lower if we do indeed trigger a recession. So it's an interesting thought exercise, and we'll see where we land on it. Let's flip away from the numbers, which is too much fun for me, and get into physical and spiritual nourishment, which is leg number 3. What do those mean to you, Keisha?
Yeah, so absolutely important, that physical, spiritual nourishment. And in the book too, that's also, we have it under that section that says build your physical, spiritual, emotional asset portfolio. And it's so important. COVID-19 has really brought home how much our health, it's just so important, right? There's no wealth without health. And so when we talk about, your physical health, and, building up yourself and protecting yourself, and during COVID-19, whatever that means to you in terms of, your daily exercise and how you nourish your body, that's also a critical piece. And so physical nourishment, spiritual nourishment, also important, and emotional nourishment. So, in the book, I talk about these various things, whether it's, daily exercise or meditation and prayer, or tuning into your intuition more to help you make better decisions. And that spiritual self-renewal on a daily basis is so important, especially during COVID-19. I remember when the COVID pandemic just hit, and we were bombarded with death figures every day. We were bombarded with so many, and we still are, right? In the news, there's so much negativity with the war in Ukraine. And sometimes we just really have to take a step back, whether it's taking a step back from the news cycle or taking a step back from social media, and just really, really, taking time for ourselves and thinking about more positive things. That's also part of that spiritual self-renewal exercise, where it's just taking that time to step back from that daily negative bombardment to build up ourselves and to renew each day and to face each day renewed and feeling energized, which is I think COVID-19 has really brought home how much those things are important for us. And so mindfulness is also a critical piece here. And that's also taken center stage, I feel like, in the pandemic as well, as we think about living more mindfully and not getting carried away with different things. And again, the news cycle comes to mind more readily. And so that physical and spiritual nourishment is also just part of that, how we nourish ourselves physically as well as spiritually. So, with eating, the healthy eating, we know how important that is, but also, that spiritual piece and that emotional piece that helps us get through these times, this collective time of trauma. COVID-19 has been a collective time of trauma. And so how do we use that, right? How do we use this pillar of holistic wealth to really get through that time of trauma? So that's also important too. And everything really ties in together, right? It's so important to talk through these things and to really build up ourselves so that it's not just, because everything is kind of a cycle. So, and everything builds on each other, especially when our finances and our mental health and our finances and our spiritual health and our finances and how we feel physically, that's also impacted. And so that's why this piece is also important.
Yeah, and what you said partway at the beginning was there is no wealth without health. And I mean, that absolutely nails it. It's great to have a lot of money, but if you're mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically broken, it's largely irrelevant, right? So really zoning in on all of that is so powerful. And one of the most powerful coaching moments I've had in my life was when a coach gave me the mantra, slow down, listen, be more patient and reflective. And I think when you were on your sabbatical, you had a similar moment where you learned the power of simply pausing, which brings us to the lesson on prayer and meditation. Why do you think that pause is so important for our spiritual and mental and even physical and emotional health?
Yeah, it's so important. And you're right. That sabbatical gave me the chance to really pause and to really meditate and reflect. Because prior to that sabbatical, we talked about, that corporate lifestyle earlier in the conversation. And, we talked about, and the business of it and how it can be stressful. And we talked about the comparison game and how that can drive you away from your mission and drive you away from your purpose. And so being able to reflect and meditate, can you bring you back to that center? Can you bring you back to that mission and purpose, which it did for me? Like I really honed in on what was important for me and how to develop this framework. And it was that sabbatical that really led to this, to this book and to this message. And that time away for 1 year, I mean, spending that time away and really thinking about how I wanted to spend my life, how I wanted to, to grow up my kids and to have that family time. That really helped in terms of, what was important to me and what was important to my mission and my purpose. And that's what going inwards does. And that's what taking the time to do this does. And it really brings you back to what's important. And I was on a cycle where I was meditating 3 hours per day on sabbatical. Like I got up like at 2 a.m. and I would meditate and I got so many insights. You know how I wrote an article called The Productivity Paradox? And that's where that productivity paradox, in life, we talk about productivity a lot. We talk about it, at work and everywhere. Economists study productivity all the time. It's just like one of those measures that we constantly measure and how productive we are. And really what came home to me was, there's a productivity paradox. And we see that now with a lot of people realizing that it's not necessarily that widget output, right? That's going to really make the difference at the end of the day. It's how much time I can hone in on that real unique contribution that I can make in this lifetime. And I think companies need to be more in tune with that to get their employees to engage in more meaningful work and also feel more, more fulfilled at work as well. So I think how we look at productivity, how we measure wealth, and, in the book I talk about this holistic wealth index, development index at the back of the book, and that ties into it because I think this whole culture of burnout, the culture of, work hard, burnout, it hasn't served us well. And so this idea of that, that meditation and that rest and that spiritual nourishment is also very important for the times we're in, because what we've seen, in the last couple of years with COVID-19 has just been unbelievable in terms of the rates of burnout and stress that we've seen.
Yeah, and it makes you start to realize when you talk about it, Keisha, it's not all of the widgets we produce. It's, as you said, the meaningful contributions. And often you can't make those meaningful contributions if you're just stuck on the hamster wheel. It's that time away that allows you to breathe, to think, to pause, to reflect, to say, well, wait a second, we're not even producing the right widget, right? Like, it's great that we made 1,000 of them, but it's 1,000 of the wrong things. What if we'd have done this? What if we did that? What if we just automated this, right? So, but you don't have time to make those good decisions unless you pause. So that's a beautiful point. Thank you. Let's slide into the fourth leg, goodwill and strong relationships. What is the importance of these two?
Yeah, so important, and I go back, as you ask that question, I go back again, right, to what happened, like that tragedy in the moment, and how goodwill and relationships help us to bounce back from life-altering setbacks. And we've seen that with COVID-19. I mean, many of us have had COVID-19 ourselves, and we've also experienced the death of other loved ones to COVID-19. I know I've lost several family members myself during this pandemic. And so relationships are everything. And it's just one of those things that I couldn't have excluded from that framework and from this book, because it's so important to how we recover from setbacks and how we, and even if you think about it from a wealth perspective, where, you think about your network as your net, your network is your net worth. And so I talk about relationships as being so important for so many different reasons. I mean, whether it's just, and we talk about goodwill with that, right? Because as we, help protect each other and help each other to bounce back from our relationships and being connected with each other and being able to share with each other, then that also helps. So relationships, I find, and this is not only like your spouse, but your friendships and your network and your loose ties. In the book, I talk about homogeneous and heterogeneous ties. And, there was a study done that, many people think, it's my homogeneous ties that are going to help me, get a job or start my business. Sometimes it's those heterogeneous ties. It's those loose relationships, those associates within your network that help you along with that. And so in the book, I talk about the importance of both those homogeneous ties and those heterogeneous ties. Or family relationships, which are homogeneous, are very important. But those heterogeneous ties are also important because they also help us build resilience. And that's how they help us build resilience, because we're also tapping into a toolbox that they have that we might not have, right? Because they have different ways of solving and innovating and solving problems and coming up with different solutions. And we might be thinking, on one track, and we get exposed to several different solutions and tracks. And so that's where those heterogeneous ties help us. And we see it in innovation. We see it in, economics. We see it in every different field there is. And we've seen it during COVID-19, right? So relationships are very important in terms of, just every aspect of holistic wealth, and every aspect of when we think about, minimizing some of the biggest stresses in our life right now, and how we move forward through setbacks.
Something you said that is often used in our circle is that your network is your net worth. And I don't think it's only for money. It's, if you surround yourself with physically fit people, you're probably more likely to be physically fit. If you surround yourself with people who meditate, you're more likely to meditate. Now, key to that is, how do we find the right relationships, Keisha? How do we go about sourcing the right friendships, the right communities, the right networks?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great question. And I feel like we need to go back to that previous, conversation when we started off with values, and we started off with looking at values and that exercise that we went through with the Holistic Wealth, Personal Workbook, where we talked about those qualities and aspirations. And how when we looked around us to the people we most admire, what are the qualities and aspirations they espouse, and what do we most admire? What are the activities they do? What are the books they're tuning into? What are they listening to? What are they doing to enrich their learning and their lifestyle? Well, that's also part of it in terms of finding the right relationships. I think it goes back to values, and that is critical in terms of friendships, associates, business, as well as with our spouses. I think values is where we start with our spouses, with our relationships. And that's why I think it's so important for us to build that list and to think about values. I think when we form relationships based on values, those tend to be some of the deepest, most sincere relationships because we espouse the same values. When our values are cross-geared or they're not in tune, then it's harder to maintain those relationships and it becomes harder to sustain them. It just wanes over time because we don't have the same values. We might have the same goals, but how we go about achieving those goals is totally different based on our values, right? Totally different based on the values we espouse. And so I think that exercise is so important in terms of looking at that mission. And if we're on a mission of community building, let's say, and we have the same values, then that's also important. But it doesn't have to be based on necessarily that, right? But like there are some core values that I think we all agree that in any relationship, even if it's a marriage or, a spousal relationship, that we need to be agreeing on certain terms of engagement and things that we all agree on.
So what we want to do is we want to look for people who share our values and have traits that we admire. So the same way we were looking for people who had traits we admire to find our own values, it's, if I admire X, Y, or Z about this person, then that's probably a person I want to spend time with. I love it. And we talked about earlier, and we said we would get to this one, so I definitely want to make sure we do, is why is service to others over the highest paid position so important to our holistic wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Clint, it goes back to a tweet. So I was on Twitter this morning and I saw a tweet of yours and you mentioned how in helping others, you're helping yourself. And I'm not saying that you're just going to help others because you want to help yourself. Absolutely not. When I saw that tweet, because there's a line in the book that actually mentions that, how sometimes you think you're helping someone else and you're helping yourself. So I've always thought about, we talk about this whole debate about service to others versus the highest paid position. So when my husband died, so this is where this came from for me. And I mean, we all know theoretically, broadly speaking, that, that sounds like right about right. But when my husband died, what came home to me was just how he walked into the hospital living and breathing and I walked out with his things, his belongings in a white plastic bag. 3 hours later, like 3 hours, I kid you not, I was walking out with some of the most prized things to us, like his wedding ring, jewelry, like things that were meaningful to us in a white plastic bag. And I had no idea that was going to happen. And so when I think about material possessions and the highest paid salary to service to others, this is what comes back to me. And his legacy and values come back to me in that moment that, even beyond me walking out with these things that are symbolic, of whatever they're symbolic in terms of material wealth, that his legacy that lived on was his impact on humanity. It wasn't anyone remembering how many houses he had, how many even rental properties. It wasn't anyone remembering how big his bank account was or his title at work. I don't even think anybody in that church at that funeral discussed his title at work. What they discussed was the values and the legacy and the impact on other people's lives. So that's bringing home that, it's obviously important to think about financial independence as we spoke about in that piece. But I really want everyone to think about too is what you'll be remembered for is not necessarily that piece. It's the values, the legacy, that impact on humanity, service to others. That's what everybody's going to walk around with in their hearts forever and remember you forever. And they're going to remember you as that angel who stepped in when they were in need. I had people come to me about my husband and they called him an angel and they said he was an archangel. Like, I kid you not. And these are people who weren't super religious. These were people who were like going to church every Sunday. These were people who were just like, they said to me the minute I met him and spoke to him, I knew there was something different. I knew that there was something so much higher his purpose in life. And that's what gave me comfort in those days afterwards. I mean, there were lots of things that gave me comfort, but those were the things, a lasting legacy that I can pass on to his kids, who, I mean, Alexander, the child who I had 8 weeks after he died, didn't get that opportunity with him. But these are the lifelong things I can pass on to him about his dad, and the things that I would want him to carry on to his children and or generations to come. That's the piece that I would want for them to carry on, is that type of legacy and that impact on other people's lives. And so that's why that chapter and that piece is so important when we think about, what's important for us. What are the transient things that will pass? Some of those things will pass, but these permanent pieces of us will live on in other people's hearts even after we're gone. And so I feel like that's also a part of true wealth. And when we think about wealth, that's also a part of that true legacy that passes on.
That's such a beautiful question and answer to end our conversation on, Keisha. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure you get across to the listeners about holistic wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have started the Institute on Holistic Wealth, as readers have come forward and have wanted to dive deeper into these topics and to really build out for themselves what that holistic wealth portfolio could look like. And that's a part of the work of the Institute. So you can check out the Institute online. It's www.instituteonholisticwealth. And of course, do also check out the podcast, the Holistic Wealth Podcast, where I, speak to other people and other experts about their journey and their journey in holistic wealth. So that's also a big part of the work that I've been doing now too, as I try to inspire other people and to engage people on how to live this holistic wealth lifestyle.
I love it. Okay, so we'll get and then that answers my next question was going to be, where can people find you? But so we'll get the Institute on Holistic Wealth into the show notes. We'll get the Holistic Wealth Podcast into the show notes, and then your personal website that they could go to, Keisha?
Yeah, and so that's KeishaBlair.com, and that's www.KeishaBlair.com, and info@KeishaBlair.com is the email that you can, I love hearing from readers and listeners, so info@KeishaBlair.com is also that email address.
Excellent. Thank you, Keisha, for joining me on the Pursuit of Learning today. I really appreciated it. And holistic wealth is something that's near and dear to my heart. And the way I found your book was I was searching different terms to sort of encompass how I sort of look at life. And I found your book and I thought, wow, this is exactly how I think. So it was a pleasure to read. We went through some of the lessons today, but there's 32 in the book. And so if you're listening, grab the book, give it a read, and reach out to the Institute on Holistic Wealth. Thanks, Keisha.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us on the Pursuit of Learning. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and head over to our website, thepursuitoflearning.com, where you will find our show notes, transcripts, and more. If you like what you see, sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, your host in learning, Clint Murphy.